Okay. And does it say Youri's recording the call?
I don't see anything saying that, but that doesn't mean it's not recording.
Okay. Well, all right. Let's take a leap of faith, and hopefully it is recording. And all right, then here it goes. Well,
did you push record? I mean,
yeah. So we'll just go on faith then that that is recording then.
Okay.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program tonight, I'm very honored to be speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne, a superb historian who teaches at the University of Houston. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies. Also teaches diplomatic and labor history and U.S. history through film. And in the future, I'm definitely going to have to talk to him about that. So who better to have on our Make Me Wanna Holler series, all things the Black diaspora from the UK to Turtle Island and beyond, than Dr. Horne, who is the author of several books, including Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean, The Rise and Fall of the Associated Negro Press, Claude Barnett's Pan-African News, and The Jim Crow Paradox, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origin of the United States of America, and Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii. And he's also written a book about W.E.B. Dubois. First off, Dr. Horne, thank you so much for coming on the program today, especially on a Saturday.
Thank you for inviting me.
A real honor to have you. And my first question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Horne, since you've written a book about W.E.B. Dubois, and so the first question I wanted to ask you is talk to us a bit about him and why our people and anyone who is interested in racial social justice should study this figure. And feel free to comment on what you think is his greatest and often overlooked legacy.
Well, W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868. He died in 1963. He was born in the United States and Massachusetts, died in West Africa, Ghana, during the administration of Kwame Nkrumah. He is renowned for being a scholar. He wrote about the African slave trade. He wrote about the U.S. politics. He wrote about African history. And he also helped to found a leading anti-racist organization here in the United States, as well as being considered a founder of the Pan-African movement, a movement that sought to unify people of African descent across geographical borders. He was a novelist and a poet and a journalist as well. So because he lived 95 years and crammed diverse activities into every day of his life, that's one of the many reasons why he is considered to be a renowned figure.
And wasn't he also? And I have to ask this. I have to ask this follow-up question because every now and then, when I'm on, Facebook or on Twitter, there's always these very polarizing conversations about W.E.B. Du Bois, of some who accuse him of sort of being what Black Agenda Report would articulate as the Black misleadership class, and others who insist that no, he wasn't that. That he's this important revolutionary icon that should be as studied and lionized as a Martin Luther King Jr., a Paul Robeson, a Malcolm X, or many of the figures of the Black Panther Party. Why is there for some reason sometimes these polarizing debates about Du Bois and his legacy?
Well, I think Du Bois made mistakes, and all of the figures you mentioned in that foregoing litany made mistakes of various sorts. Paul Robeson, for example, we just marked his 125th birthday. He celebrated the fact that his ancestors were involved in the 18th century in the battle against British rule that led to the foundation of the United States of America. Historians increasingly today are not celebrating the foundation of the United States of America. They see it as a struggle to enslave more Africans and to further dispossess the indigenous. The Black Panther Party, basically, they adopted a political line whereby they suggested that the lumpen was the vanguard of a revolutionary movement. That is to say, they had different definitions, which was part of the fuzziness, but drug dealers, pimps, etc., which, shall we say, was misleading at best. So I could go down this list, and Du Bois, of course, his major mistake was to counsel Black people to get involved in World War I.
Okay.
The capitalist forces seeking to redivide the planet, particularly redivide Africa. There's a new book out by the historian Chad Williams called The Wounded World that talks about that mistake by Du Bois and how he was very apologetic about it. But to err is human, as the saying goes. And if you're going to be in the arena, you're going to make mistakes. I've made a few myself. I dare say you may have made a few yourself. Some of the
Definitely.
critics probably made mistakes as well. The question is, are you able to correct those mistakes? Were the mistakes inevitable? Did they flow ineluctably from misguided ideology, for example? And so it's not enough to say someone made a mistake. You have to analyze the factors I just mentioned.
But and one of the things he was involved with was the was he worked alongside Paul Robeson on the We Charge genocide campaign. Can you talk about that? Because I knew that Paul Robeson was very much involved but I actually did not know until doing further research that W.E. Du Bois was also part of that effort to get the international community to take on the plight of Black people in the United States.
Well, the Robeson petition was filed circa 1950, 1951. Under the aegis of a left-leaning group called the Civil Rights Congress that was led by Robeson's comrade, speaking of the Black communist lawyer, William L. Patterson, who I've written a biography about, you might know. Du Bois worked on that campaign, but even before that campaign, when he had yet to be purged from the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the organization he had helped to found circa 1909, 1910.
And still very dominant today, that organization.
That is true. He had worked on a petition with them. So yes, Du Bois was very much involved in the international arena. The Pan-African Congresses, for example, they took place mostly in Europe. The most pivotal one took place in Manchester, UK, circa 1945. Kwame Nkrumah was amongst the leaders who were present there. They laid the foundation and created a blueprint for the anti-colonial surge that was to culminate in Ghanaian independence in 1957 and a good deal of Africa by 1960 and 1963.
Interesting. So, in conclusion, we should be studying W.E. Du Bois, right?
Oh, of course. Especially his work on the African slave trade, which was published in the 1890s. Especially his work, Black Reconstruction, a study of the United States after the U.S. Civil War and what happens to the newly freed, formerly enslaved. It's published in the 1930s. So those two books in particular, I would recommend to your audience.
And actually, I wasn't planning on asking about this, but briefly, if you can you talk to us about James Baldwin, and can you enlighten us on who he was as a person, and his involvement in trying to eradicate Jim Crow and racial capitalism, or racial crapitalism, as I prefer to call it.
Well, James Baldwin was a writer, a novelist, a playwright, an essayist in particular. His leading works include Fire Next Time, a collection of essays. His novels include Another Country, Giovanni's Room. He wrote film criticism as well, much of it collected in the thick volume entitled The Devil Finds Work. Very interesting title, no doubt. He was also involved in the movement against US apartheid in the 1960s, the anti-Jim Crow movement, as some might have it. And he also is considered to be an icon of the LBGT movement because that is how he was oriented. He lived intermittently in both France and in Turkey, or Turkey, as it now prefers to be called.
Interesting.
And he's a historic figure.
And did you think that the documentary "I Am Not Your Negro"? Do you think it did justice to who he was as a historical figure and his views, or if you feel it didn't do justice to him, what would you like to have seen that sort of celebration of his life have done?
Well, I thought it did justice. As you know, it was created by the filmmaker of Haitian extraction, Raoul Peck, who I believe resides in Europe. Last I looked, he was living in Germany. And his last film is particularly noteworthy, Exterminate All the Brutes, a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism, very creatively done. But his film on James Baldwin also is a standout.
All right, I'll have to check that out. And I wanted to I wanted your thoughts on this. Explain to an audience what is critical race theory, and why, of course, we know why reactionary right wingers are afraid of it, but explain to if you had the chance to talk to a white socialist or a white Marxist, why they should not be afraid of critical race theory.
I hope
why they should not be afraid of it being taught.
Well, I hope they're not afraid of it. I mean, if so, we're in more trouble than I think we are. I mean, actually, Marxists or socialists should see it as a way of bringing the science of society into Black studies, because it basically posits that racism is structural. It's not just a product of people having bad thoughts or bad intentions, that it grows inevitably out of the structure of society. It started in law schools as law professors and law students and lawyers were increasingly frustrated by the law in the United States, that is. And they came to the conclusion that the way society was structured, it would inevitably lead to insidious and invidious discrimination against Black people in particular, but not least. So I trust, just to ask you a question, that you haven't spoken to so-called, quote, white socialists, unquote, who are upset with critical race theory. Are they?
I will not reveal any names, but yes, off the record, I have heard some white socialists and white Marxists describe critical race theory as sort of identity politics as sort of identity politics gone mad and stuff like that. And then some of the kind of like knee-jerk reaction of you know of you know of how can how can I explain it? Some who think that, like, yes, racism exists, but I'm not guilty of it. Ergo, why should this be studied and all that and all that jazz?
Well, those are strange Marxists if they're reducing racism to the individual level. What about capitalism? I mean, what about the African slave trade helping to propel capitalism? And speaking of that term, identity politics, what about this term white, unquote, which, as I point out in my book on the 16th century, is a device coming out of London that allows the English in particular to unite under one umbrella those who they had been warring against, the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh in the first instance, under a new identity, politics of identity, speaking of whiteness, once they crossed the Atlantic. It gave them a basis for unity by which they could enhance struggles against the native peoples, the First Nations, the indigenous people, and ultimately enslave the Africans. So I would say to these so-called socialists and Marxists, they need to do a bit more reading. They need to do a bit more studying. In a book I have coming out on Washington, D.C. in a few days, I quote the late, great Black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier for the proposition that what's radical in one epoch or one era may not be radical in another epoch. And so if there is a science of society, you have to keep studying, you have to keep upgrading your ideology. Otherwise, you're like the biology teacher who never found out about DNA and therefore does not bring it into the classroom. And it's sort of befuddled when a student asks about it. So that may be one of the many reasons why capitalism still reigns, although I dare say its tenure is rapidly receding.
That's a perfect segue, because that's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is how do you overcome, what I feel is a very toxic debate of the whole identity politics versus the class struggle. And I'm wondering, how do you approach it, or how would you approach it with, again, some of our, white socialist Marxist comrades in this is how we chew gum and walk at the same time. This is how we slay all the evils with one stone, or one, AR-15, if that's the weapon of choice.
Well, this is like the ABCs of politics. Maybe but if you look at Black people in the United States, it's the constituency that votes most consistently against the right wing, against the fascist forces. Whereas a good deal of the Euro-American working class have been won over by the right wing and by the fascists. And yet, those who vote 9-1 against the fascists are subject to criticism by some of these so-called socialists, and they have no clue as to why a good deal of the Euro-American working class votes with the fascists, except to say that, well, maybe the opposition needs to come up with a more radical agenda, and then instead of voting for the radical right, they'd vote for the radical left, which is really just an apologia. It's just an excuse for backwardness. If you look at Black people in the United States, we were unpaid workers, or slaves, to use that term, and we engaged in relentless class struggle, trying to overthrow the system, which we were able to do in the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, countless slave revolts in North America. And that legacy of class struggle has been passed on to Black people today, which is one of the reasons why we vote against the right wing. So people really need to do some studying, or perhaps that's being subjective on my part. Perhaps this ignorance is not a product of lack of study. Maybe the ignorance is another example of class collaboration. Perhaps the ignorance is another example of that kind of class collaboration that was so essential to settler colonialism, whereby Europeans of various class backgrounds united for mutual advantage, taking the land away from the Native Americans and profiting from unpaid African labor. So in any case, either these folks you're talking about are hopeless cases, in which case we can move on, or perhaps they just need to do some more study.
You know, before I get to that, before I get to actually my next question, I actually, something you said, I think requires a bit, requires a bit of a follow up, in which, it's interesting how, so many times, you do get from white leftists often, lecturing, people of color, or lecturing, feminist movements, or often lecturing, the LGBTQ plus, movements that, that they don't put enough, that they don't put enough effort in talking about class when they're talking about, their legitimate grievances and stuff like that. And yet, oftentimes, when you actually do, as you mentioned, we just talked about, W.E.B, Dubois, and when we talk about, even, many of the indigenous groups, or even, groups like, the ACT UP movement, the famous, LGBT-led AIDS and healthcare, reform movement, that, those are people that knew how to chew gum and walk at the same time, and often, and even, during the miners' strikes, there was a very famous, gay-led organization that showed solidarity to the miners, and oftentimes, it's often, the majority white, male, cisgender, leftist movements that often doesn't show solidarity the right way, or often, I think they are the ones. I mean, that often, should also take their own advice when it comes to how to chew gum and walk at the same time. Your thoughts on that?
Well, what's the question?
Well, I was just sort of, reflecting about how, oftentimes, you have, as you mentioned, white, socialists, white Marxists who say that, who often like to lecture, marginalized groups like Black people or other people about, that we're too much focused, that we focus too much on identity politics and not enough on the class struggle, when really those marginalized groups, like our people, have often we do chew gum and walk at the same time. We do deal with the issue of of racism, and also recognize that racism, institutional racism, is part of the same coin as capitalism, the very system that the often white working class wants to eradicate, or claims that they want to eradicate.
Well, I mean, let's let this be the last point on this, because it's sort of ridiculous. I've just said that Black people in particular vote 9-1 against the right. They're the folks who are most likely to join trade unions. If you look at the leadership of communist parties in the United States, they've been disproportionately populated by Black people, for example. So I don't know what these people are talking about. All I can say is what I've already said. Perhaps they don't want to deal with class collaboration. Perhaps they don't want to explain why it is, for example, that in 1991, in the state of Louisiana in the United States, that you had a race for governor where David Duke, a leader of the Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization, got 55% of the Euro-American vote across class lines. Most of these people on the left, that might come as a shock to them, because they're so busy nitpicking Black people that they've lost sight of the real problem. And as I said, that might not be an accident. This may just be another intellectual form of class collaboration. So in any case, other than handing them a syllabus, I think we should move on.
This is why some of them should actually take critical race theory courses, actually. And I wanted to ask you, what is the state of the Black liberation movement in demanding, in demanding radical demands? I can't believe I actually wrote that. In other words, are any of the Black Lives Matter organizations or Black churches or even the multiracial organizations, in your state of Texas or elsewhere that that you're aware of, campaigning on ending the drug war, amending the Constitution to close that loophole in the 13th Amendment that says that you can still be a slave if you've been convicted of a crime, or repealing the Clinton crime bill and the Welfare Reform Act? And if the answer is no, why do you think why do you think that is? That more organizations aren't campaigning on the issues I just mentioned to to address the many grievances that Black people and other marginalized communities are facing.
Well, once again, one of the I'm doing an interview next week on U.S. domestic politics, which is a very frustrating subject to talk about for reasons I've already adduced in our previous exchanges, because the stumbling block to progressive and radical change is oftentimes the Euro-American working class does not vote as class interest. It engages in class collaboration. If you look at some of those campaigns that you mentioned, the drug war, the 13th Amendment, those are all domestic issues. And so Black people are 13% of the US population. Overwhelming majorities of that 13% are in favor of these reforms. But if you do the math, you ought to be able to figure out why the 13% cannot force through changes that oftentimes requires 51%. There's a gap between those two figures, as you might easily figure out. So that's one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time talking about foreign policy, because historically, what's helped to drive progressive change in the United States is external events. The Haitian Revolution leads to a general crisis of the slave system that leads to its collapse. In the United States, the rise of the socialist camp, national liberation movements, causes the US rulers to suspect that they all have difficulty winning hearts and minds in Africa and the Caribbean as long as US apartheid persists, and that creates pressure for US apartheid to retreat. And so until some of your friends on the left were able to figure out this simple equation that I've just explained, I'm afraid that the North Atlantic community as a whole will be on the cusp of a peculiar kind of fascism, because let's face it, as we speak, you see that the United States is trying to start a new Cold War with China. There were significant military maneuvers off the coast of China. They're probably still going on. Today is April 15th, 2023. You saw that after President Macron came back from China and expressed some reservation about the new Cold War with China, he was excoriated and denounced, at least on this side of the Atlantic, by leaders in Washington. And it's not an accident that there are hundreds of US military bases overseas, including one of its key bases not far from you in Germany.
Well, Belgium, we're considered belly of the beast, and headquarters of NATO and so forth, and yeah, so
yeah, exactly. And so, in order to push through political change, you need an analysis of the forces, particularly the class forces. And as our exchanges have shown, some of our friends on the left, they're not able to do a class analysis, which means they're not able to develop organizations that can push through these changes because they're not really sure where the problem rests. I mean, if they're talking all the time about identity politics and thinking Black people are the problem, well, no wonder we may be on the verge of fascism.
Unbelievable. But at the same and at the same time, but at the same time, you've talked about how W.E. Du Bois, and it still is a problem, to this day, where where some of the big black civil rights organizations don't want to address the issue of imperialism overseas, and even sort of kind of excommunicate the Paul Robesons, the W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world for speaking out on imperialism. So and I'm wondering, is that still an issue when when people talk about radically reducing the powers of the police? Some even want to abolish the police. Is it still very difficult in that conversation to include the CIA, the NSA, and the U.S. military in that?
Well, certainly the NAACP has yet to recover from the purges of the left that took place more than 7 decades ago. It's a quintessential liberal organization, which means that, among other things, it rarely engages questions of foreign policy, rarely engages questions of imperialism. It studiously tries to avoid associating with anybody to the left of liberal. I think that this is a product of the fact that when organizations and individuals do speak up on foreign policy or do veer to the left, the radical left, they oftentimes end up badly. They end up being shot by a lone crazed gunman, as the cliche goes. They end up in jail. They end up being driven into exile, where they no longer can have contact with their families. And so that's instinctively understood by many organizations like the NAACP. So they don't go there. It's just like if you have a dog and you set up some sort of force field so that if the dog strays beyond your lawn, they get a shock and they come right back. And that's what happens to these organizations. They don't want to get that shock. And so they avoid straying beyond certain parameters. And that's sad, but understandable.
And briefly, what's your position on how to deal with the pandemic of police brutality or state terror? Are you in favor of of radical reforms and restructuring the police, or are you in favor of abolitionism? Why one or the other? And I'm curious, your thoughts on community control over the police as a way to get to a place where we see an end to just to this endless carnage of of the racist state terror that the police unleash on Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, and so forth.
Well, in Chicago, they just voted for a form of community control of the police. I recommend that to your attention. Sporadically and intermittently, there have been appeals to the international community, the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, for example. But once again, I'm beginning to sound like a broken record. When you talk about domestic politics in the United States, as we speak in Indianapolis, Indiana, a group called the National Rifle Association is meeting. It has a mass base, Euro-Americans across class lines. You know about all these mass shootings that take place in this country. In the past few days, there was one in Louisville, there was one in Nashville. I mean, it happens all the time. And this National Rifle Association protests when there's any attempt to have gun control. And the National Rifle Association and the people who are associated with the National Rifle Association, which are mostly Euro-Americans across class lines, including a goodly number of Euro-American working class people, they're against police reform. And so once again, let's talk about foreign policy, because you keep asking why Black people are 13% of the country, although we're overrepresented on death row, overrepresented in the prisons. And that reality is not solely due to us. It's due to these reactionaries. And that's why, looking historically, I'm much more in favor of generating, especially since you're in Belgium, generating pressure globally on US imperialism, lengthening the battlefield, bringing more people into this conversation. Because if we're just relying upon the forces in the United States to bring progressive or radical change, history shows that that can be a fool's errand.
That's quite unbelievable. And actually, I wasn't going to ask this question about the Second Amendment, but I feel, since I'm going to break my rule and ask a follow-up question about the Second Amendment. But don't you think that the reason why even the most modest of gun control reform that will never ever pass because of that ridiculous Second Amendment? And as you mentioned, I think even if the most left wing of politicians, so say somebody from the Green Party or someone from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, I think if anyone was to flirt with the idea of why don't we just amend the Constitution and repeal the Second Amendment, they would be their career or their aspirations of political office would be over, in the blink of an eye, don't you think? Because of that Second Amendment and this bizarre, defense of, as you mentioned, of the mostly white working class that wants to keep the Second Amendment.
Well, I should say one before some of these aforementioned so-called European socialists freak out. It's a class collaboration. It's not just the Euro-American working class. It's the 1%. It's the Euro-American elite. The working class is just the base. They're the ones who deliver the votes for tax cuts to the wealthy, for example. And then they feel that there'll be some sort of trickle down to themselves, I assume. The Second Amendment to the US Constitution, which you're referring to, comes into existence in the 18th century so that you could have militias of the settlers organized to fight against the Native Americans and keep the enslaved in line. And today, the right wing says explicitly that they are in favor of a proliferation of weapons because if a government comes to power of which they do not approve, they want to be able to shoot it out of power. They make that clear. Yeah. And these people who are supposedly the patriots, whose rationale is basically overthrowing governments, which of course you saw an attempt on January 6, 2021. But those are very difficult realities for many people to arrive at. And so then, therefore, they prefer fantasies or misleading propaganda, like saying, oh, if these Negroes can only be convinced to get rid of identity politics, we'd be well on our way to socialism. Other sorts of nonsense, which, as I said, I don't necessarily see as a product of ignorance. I see it as a product, another sophisticated form or perhaps unsophisticated form of class collaboration.
That's quite unbelievable. But then I'm wondering, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, is I'm sort of wondering then, because it's funny because at the same time the U.S. has a pretty robust left movement in terms of
really.
In terms of anti-imperialism, in terms of queer liberationist politics, feminist politics, a workers' rights movement, and so forth. I think the U.S. does have a very powerful movement. That does not translate often to in power, but at the same time there really is this strong devotion to Americanism. So, for example, like in Canada, because I cover a lot of Canadian topics, there are calls to to cancel Canada Day. In Australia, which is just as white supremacist, racial capitalist as the United States, every January when Australia Day comes, there's large protests led by Aboriginal people to demand canceling Australia Day, and there's been similar calls.
What about the United States canceling July 4th?
Well, that's what I was about to ask. Like, do you when do you think there will come a point in the U.S. where more and more of the left calls for canceling the 4th of July and Columbus Day?
Well, in the United States, as my own, I wrote a book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origin of the United States of America. And in that book, I pointed out what is obvious, what many historians have known for decades, which is that Black people did not stand alongside George Washington when he fought the Redcoats, because they suspected what was true, that this slave owner and real estate speculator would seek to enhance and increase the African slave trade and fight more Native Americans to seize their land. Of course, some of the most severe attacks upon me have come from the left, because they see July 4th as something to be celebrated. Unlike Canada, unlike Australia, I noticed in Australia, before meetings, even by Labor Party, I'm not even sure if the Liberals or the Conservatives do this.
Well,
let me finish. Let me finish the point. I'm not sure if the Liberals do this, but in Australia, they'll have some sort of land acknowledgement. They'll say, we're here on the land of this particular indigenous people. I heard an Australian person who lives in the United States on the radio here in the United States just the other day, and she was wondering, why didn't we have that in the United States? I think it's because the United States was created as a product of counter-revolution. It was created over the objections of the Africans, over the objections of the preponderance of the indigenous population. And if you have a counter-revolution that then leads to benefits for European settlers and to others who are melanin deficient, well, unsurprisingly, many of them, they like that system. As a matter of fact, they might even like to go back to the 18th century, which is one of the reasons why there is this worshiping of an 18th century constitution, because that automatically brings us back. It automatically turns back the clock of time. But once again, in order for that recognition to become more widespread, we need more external pressure on this country.
Interesting, and what I was going to say was that in Australia, the right wing party, like the version of the Republican Party in Australia, there are two. There's the National Party, and then there's the Liberal Party, which often confuses people, because when people think of liberals, they think of compassionate conservatives and whatnot. But the Liberal Party in Australia is is the right wing party. But yes, in Australia they do land acknowledgement. Canada, they also do land acknowledgements. But I would say, in terms of settler colonialism and white supremacy, I would say Australia and the U.S. tend to be the most unwilling to address the ongoing brutal mistreatment of indigenous people, whereas in New Zealand, things are not all hunky-dory, but there seems to be much more of a willingness to try to better race relations. And Canada, Canada is only now just starting to recognize its settler colonial its settler colonial past, which is actually a perfect segue to this, my second to last question to you, Dr. Horne, which is, we've been talking about, Black history, and we've been talking about, the unjust, ghastly system that is white supremacy, racial capitalism. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering, when do you think what do you think it's going to take, though, for the U.S. left? I would say, whether it's Black racial justice groups, Latinx justice groups, eco-socialist groups, the workers' rights movement, and and others, to show more, and of course the anti-imperialist, anti-war movement, to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans. Because I know you've talked a lot about settler colonialism, and you've mentioned the plight of Indigenous people. And I'm wondering, when do you think it's going to take for the U.S. left to show more urgent solidarity to our Indigenous people and get to the level it's at in either Canada or Canada, New Zealand?
I wish I could answer that question. I'm not sure what it will take. And it is rather shocking, though, that the United States, people in the United States and the US left, they don't draw reasonable inferences. That is to say, Canada as an independent country was not born as a result, as a product of a revolt against British rule. Neither was Australia. The United States was. And yet the United States is to the right of these countries. So you would think that the reasonably minded would draw certain inferences. Perhaps they would say, maybe what was involved in 1776 was not a revolution, but a counter-revolution. Maybe that's the explanation. I'm not, they haven't reached that realization yet. Or maybe they would look at Canada and say, oh, Canada has a single-payer healthcare system that the United States can only aspire towards right now. Canada did not come into being as a result of a revolt against British rule. The United States did. So maybe what happened in the 18th century in the United States, given the fact that it was led by slave owners, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, et al., and that the enslaved population generally did not support it. The indigenous were split because the settlers, as has been their historic tendency, made false promises to the indigenous.
Classic divide and conquer.
Right. So, but, changes are afoot in the world. It reminds me of the meeting a few days ago in Moscow between President Xi Jinping and President Putin. And as President Xi is leaving, he says, changes are afoot in the world that this planet hasn't seen in a century or so. And there's something to that. You get the same feeling from the visit of the president of Brazil to China, which is unfolding as we speak on April 15th, 2023. And I dare say that those sorts of external events will have ultimately significant impact on the United States of America because socialists, at least the ones with their heads screwed on right, they tend to see our movement as not necessarily constrained by geographical borders, not necessarily constrained by the limitations and restrictions of present-day nation states, particularly since the geographical borders change all the time. I mean, 30 years ago, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, as was Georgia and Kazakhstan, et cetera. 125 years ago, Hawaii was an independent country. 125 years ago, Cuba was a Spanish colony. So why are we being constrained by these geographic borders when they're perpetually changing? Instead, I think we need a global analysis. The old slogan, which I had thought was a socialist slogan, workers of the world unite. They didn't say workers of the United States unite. Workers of the world unite, still has relevance. Although we do also recall that about 100 years ago, the slogan in South Africa was white workers of the world, white workers unite, or Workers Unite for a White South Africa, for example, which could have been a slogan in the United States as well. That is to say, Workers Unite for a White United States of America. That's the kind of history that some would prefer to ignore. So,
Yeah.
how long, as Dr. King used to say? Not long.
So, it's been, so do you think when it comes to, solidarity to, indigenous people and that, movement finally getting to the level that the black civil that the black civil rights movement was, whether it was in the 60s, now come through more international pressure, more international solidarity, and but also people within the United States. It sounds to me from our conversation that we need that in terms of decolonizing our own minds, we need to do sort of more of that.
Well, certainly we need more internationalism. I mean, we made a brief reference to the NAACP when I tried to explain how and why they lost their internationalism, because at one time they were, but they decided that the better part of wisdom was to stray away from that which brings bludgeoning and condemnation and worse from the US ruling class and its acolytes, who heavily populate the Euro-American working class and middle class. But despite it all, I remain optimistic. I mean, if you look at events in the United States in the last few weeks, for example, you had a black union organizer become mayor of Chicago. You had the right wing lose an important race for a seat on the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin. You saw Mr. Trump indicted, and that's, of course, the first of a number of indictments, although I should say quickly that that apparently has not harmed his popularity amongst his base. He got 75 million votes.
Yeah. And apparently, apparently, I think Margaret Kimberly pointed out, in her column at Black Agenda Report, that even if he is found guilty of whatever, it doesn't even bar him from running for office.
No, he could be in jail and still be president, be in a prison cell. Although that bizarrely may take place, but that speaks to his popularity. And it's not enough, as some of our friends on the left would say, that, the reason he's so popular is because the opposition is not radical enough. As I said.
Or it's too woke.
These are the same political base that voted for a fascist for governor in 1991. So I guess you would say in Louisiana in 1991, if David Duke had run against a socialist, he wouldn't have gotten 55% of the vote. I mean, this is nonsense. I mean, come on, people, come back to earth, please.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. But you are optimistic, though, that hopefully the left can kind of get shit together, or even if a lot of it doesn't get its shit together, the mostly white socialist Marxist left who do have these racist blind spots and do continue to lionize the founding fathers who Glenn Ford called those miserable sons of a bitches. Do you think that any big radical change or shift to the left, or at least an adversarial left culture, that's going to be mostly led by actually Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and probably women and queer people of all colors?
I think that this movement of opposition, if you look at it today, it'll be embodied in those who are voting against the right in significant numbers. That begins with the descendants of the formerly enslaved, who, as noted, votes against the right by ratios of 9 to 1. that includes many within the Latinx community who's voting against the right is usually 6-4 or 7-3. The Asian Pacific population, it's in a state of flux right now, but they tend to vote against the right 55-45. In the South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, etc., Louisiana. In the deepest part of the South, Mississippi, Alabama, across class lines, the descendants of those who most resemble the settlers, they vote for the right, sometimes 9-1 across class lines. You know, you have a lot of people on the left who don't even know that. I mean, they're like doctors who don't know medicine. I mean, would you go to a doctor to treat a broken leg who didn't know medicine? Would you go to a political activist for advice to treat a broken country who doesn't know the basic facts of the political terrain on which we're struggling? I would think not, I would hope not. But alas, this is where we are right now.
Second to last question. Glenn, is there anything you want to say on the legacy of the late Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon of Black Agenda reports?
Well, I knew Glenn much better because I worked with him. You can probably still find some of our interviews online. He interviewed me numerous times over the years. So we collaborated. And in my 16th century book, I start out with a quote from Andrew Young, who's still around. He was an aide to Martin Luther King. And he was quoted in the 1970s as charging that it was London that invented racism. And Glenn told me that Andrew Young made that comment in an interview that Glenn was doing with Andrew Young, for example.
Actually, wait, repeat that again. So the introduction to your book, London created racism. Wait, actually, yeah. No, repeat that again, because I completely missed something there. Something very important there.
In my book on the 16th century,
yeah,
it starts out with, the book is entitled The Dawning of the Apocalypse. Starts out with a quote from Andrew Young, a one-time aide to Martin Luther King Jr., who is still in the land of the living, speaking of Andrew Young. And Andrew Young in the quote says that London invented racism. Glenn told me that Andrew Young made that statement in an interview that Glenn was doing with Andrew Young. That Glenn is the one who elicited that controversial viewpoint. And of course, Andrew Young began to backpedal, as I talk about in the book, because ruling class, they don't like the Anglo-American ruling class. They're officially against racism. It's just like in London, they want to talk about Britain's role in abolishing the slave trade, not Britain's role in perpetuating the slave trade. So in any case, all praise is due to Glenn Ford.
All righty. Well, we end the program. We end the program doing the questionnaire that was first done by Marcel Proust and later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and done by my hero, the late great James Lipton. Dr. Horne, it's your turn to do the questionnaire. So let's go. And then you can finally enjoy your weekends. Dr. Horne, what's your favorite word?
Struggle, victory.
What is your
decolonization, socialism?
What's your least favorite words?
Capitalism, racism, war, anti-peace.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Oh, I don't know. Good music, good art, good food.
Then what turns you off then?
Racism, capitalism.
All those least favorite words of yours, right?
Exactly.
And what's your favorite curse word?
I really don't curse, to be frank with you.
Really? Not even an F-bomb? Not
Well, if you try to raise children, you try to set a good example, and you don't want to curse around your children because they may start imitating you because they tend to imitate adults. So I try not to curse.
Okay. So no favorite seven, and nothing of the 7 dirty words of George Carlin?
It's not my thing.
Alrighty. What sound or noise do you love?
What?
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, music, of course.
Then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Oh, bad music. Poorly performed music.
Such as so.
I don't want to embarrass any musicians. They know who they are.
You'll tell me off air, off the record, and it'll be our secret. Then, what profession, if you weren't doing what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to attempt to do?
Oh, I don't know. Perhaps being a professional athlete. Perhaps professional athlete.
Any particular sports or two
Maybe
sports?
basketball, baseball.
Baseball and basketball. Okay. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Oh, running a Fortune 500 corporation.
Me too. And I actually don't want to work for any of them, even if the money was good. And lastly, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision or belief in the afterlife? And even if you are an atheist, please still feel free to answer.
That's hard to answer because if you look at the current issue of the Journal of African American History, there's a review of my book on the 16th century. And the reviewer pulls out this quote from the book where I explain how and why it is that Spain, sponsoring Christopher Columbus in 1492, had first movers advantage, but yet sunk into decline over that century, whereas London, or England, this dysfunctional country on the periphery of Europe, began to rise. And what I say, and partial explanation that's pulled out in the winter 2023 Journal of African American History, is that Spain took religion too seriously. I won't go into what I meant by that, but if I must say, I think that's sort of a historic point made by a Black person, because as you know, many of these Black people, they're strongly Christian. And those who stand up against Christianity become strongly Muslim.
Yes, and yeah.
There are not that many of us who are not into either. And so it's difficult for me to say anything about heaven because it's not a concept that I accept. And I don't want to go further than that because I'm a political person. I don't want to alienate my Christian or Muslim friends. So let's just leave it at that.
All righty. A great sophisticated way of saying no comments. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dr. Gerald Horne of the University of Houston, Professorship of History and African American Studies. And Dr. Horne, I hope that this will be the first of many conversations. I definitely want to have you on, if possible, during the 4th of July and us, shitting on that holiday and talk about, and in fact, when I was doing some research about you, that you've actually written critically about film in Hollywood. So I would definitely love to have you back on in the future for that. But until then, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for taking the time off, especially on a Saturday, to come on. And again, I hope that this will be the first of many conversations.
Thank you for inviting me, and be sure to send me the link.
Will do.